In the vast expanse of the Galactic Confederation, where 1,000 civilized species had learned to coexist through diplomacy, trade, and carefully negotiated peace treaties, there existed an unspoken truth that every alien diplomat whispered in the shadowed corridors of their embassy ships: never corner a human. For 300 years, humanity had played by the galaxy's rules. They had bent their necks to alien oversight, submitted to protective regulations that treated them like dangerous animals, and endured the condescending smiles of species who viewed Earth as nothing more than a quaint death world whose inhabitants had somehow stumbled into space travel. The humans had been patient. They had been diplomatic. They had been civilized. But patience, even human patience, has its limits. The Zephyrian ambassador had made one crucial mistake that fateful day aboard the neutral station of Kepler 442b. As he held the blood-stained collar of the human child, a collar that had been required by galactic law for all humans under the age of 18, he had smiled that same condescending smile that had haunted humanity for centuries and said the words that would echo through the galaxy forever. Perhaps now you Deathworlders will finally learn your place. What the ambassador didn't understand, what none of the civilized species had bothered to learn in their 3 centuries of casual oppression, was that humans had been holding back not out of weakness, but out of mercy. They had been playing by alien rules not because they had to, but because they had chosen to believe that coexistence was possible. That belief died with the child. In the 18 hours that followed, the galaxy would learn why every predator on Earth had learned to fear the persistence hunter. They would discover why death worlds forge the strongest steel. And they would finally understand that when Deathworlders stop playing games, civilizations fall. This is the story of the day humanity reminded the galaxy why they were called Deathworlders in the first place. This is the story the merchant quarter of Kepler Station buzzed with the usual cacophony of interstellar commerce. Holographic advertisements flickered in 17 different languages while traders from across the galaxy haggled over everything from Andromedan silk to Terran coffee. The air recyclers worked overtime to accommodate the atmospheric preferences of dozens of species, creating pockets of thin, oxygen-rich air that made most aliens dizzy, but felt like home to the handful of humans scattered throughout the massive commercial hub. Captain Sarah Chun moved through the crowded marketplace with the easy confidence of someone who had spent the last 15 years navigating alien bureaucracy. Her daughter Maya walked beside her, the mandatory tracking collar around the 8-year-old's neck glinting under the station's artificial sunlight. Sarah's jaw clenched every time she caught sight of that collar, but she had learned long ago to pick her battles. The Galactic Confederation had made their position clear. Humans under 18 were considered potentially volatile biological weapons and required constant monitoring. It was humiliating, but it was the price of membership in galactic society. "Mom, why do the Regalian vendors keep staring at us?" Maya asked, her small hand finding Sarah's as they passed a cluster of tall, gray-skinned aliens who had indeed been tracking their movement with obvious suspicion. "They're just not used to seeing humans in this sector," Sarah replied, the practice lie rolling off her tongue. The truth was more complicated. Humans made most aliens nervous. Earth was classified as a Class 12 death world, a planet so hostile that the mere fact that intelligent life had evolved there was considered an aberration by galactic standards. The fact that humans had not only survived but thrived on a world filled with predators, natural disasters, and toxic flora was viewed with a mixture of awe and terror by the rest of the galaxy. Sarah led Maya toward the section of the station dedicated to human registered businesses. It was smaller than the areas allocated to other species, reflecting humanity's junior status in the Confederation. But it felt like a small slice of home. The artificial gravity was set to Earth standard, the air was properly oxygenated, and the merchants actually smiled when they saw them coming instead of reaching for panic buttons. "Sarah, Maya, over here." The voice belonged to Marcus Rodriguez, an old friend from Earth who had been running a small shipping business out of Kepler Station for the past 3 years. His weathered face broke into a genuine grin as he waved them over to his cargo bay. Marcus, good to see you, Sarah said, accepting the bear hug that would have crushed most aliens. How's business? Can't complain. The Altarians can't get enough of Terran spices, and the vegans are paying premium prices for Earth-grown coffee. Marcus ruffled Maya's hair affectionately. And how's my favorite space explorer doing? Maya beamed up at him. I learned how to calculate hyperspace jump coordinates yesterday. Mom says if I keep studying, I might be able to apply for the academy when I turn 16. The smile faltered slightly on Marcus's face. The Galactic Naval Academy accepted human applicants, but they required a recommendation from 3 alien sponsors and a psychological evaluation that most human candidates failed. The unspoken assumption was that humans were too aggressive and unpredictable for positions of responsibility in the galactic military. That's wonderful, kiddo, Marcus said, his voice carefully neutral. You keep studying those star charts. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of 3 Zephyrian officials. The tall, blue-skinned aliens moved with the characteristic arrogance of a species that had been one of the founding members of the Galactic Confederation. Their leader, distinguished by the gold circlet around his elongated skull, approached with the measured pace of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Human Captain Chun, the lead Zephyrian said, his voice carrying the artificial politeness that aliens reserve for dealing with potentially dangerous inferiors. I am Ambassador Vexhai of the Zephyrian Diplomatic Corps. I understand you are requesting transit authorization for the Proxima Centauri system. Sarah straightened, falling automatically into the formal posture required when addressing high-ranking alien officials. Yes, Ambassador. Standard cargo run for Rodriguez shipping. All documentation is in order. Indeed, Vexhai's pale eyes fixed on Maya, and something cold and predatory entered his expression. However, there has been a change in Confederation policy regarding human dependence in contested space. New regulations require additional screening for any human under the age of majority traveling within 3 parsecs of the Proxima system. Sarah felt her blood begin to run cold. What kind of additional screening? Standard psychological evaluation, biological sampling, and extended quarantine observation. Vexhai's tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing cargo manifests rather than subjecting a child to what amounted to imprisonment and experimentation. The process typically takes 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the subject cooperation. Absolutely not. The words were out of Sarah's mouth before she could stop them. Maya is not a subject, she's my daughter, and she's done nothing wrong. The temperature in the cargo bay seemed to drop several degrees. Vexhai's companions shifted nervously, their hands moving closer to the neural disruptors at their belts. The ambassador himself remained perfectly still, but his pale eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement. Captain Chun, I believe you misunderstand your position here, he said softly. The Galactic Confederation has been remarkably tolerant of human eccentricities for the past 3 centuries. Your species has been granted membership, trading privileges, and protection under galactic law despite your obvious biological instabilities. In return, we expect compliance with regulations designed to protect civilized society from potential threats. Potential threats? Sarah's voice was deadly quiet. She's 8 years old. She is a human child, raised on a death world, with genetic predispositions toward violence that her immature neural development cannot adequately suppress, Vexhai replied, his tone growing more condescending with each word. The monitoring collar provides basic behavioral modification, but extended exposure to space travel requires more comprehensive safeguards. Maya had gone very still beside her mother, her small face pale with confusion and fear. She didn't understand all the words being used, but she understood the tone. She understood that these aliens were talking about taking her away from her mother. The collar stays, Sarah said firmly. But you are not taking my daughter anywhere for testing. Vexhai's expression hardened. Captain Chun, I'm afraid that decision is no longer yours to make. As of this moment, the minor human designated Maya Chun is remanded to Confederation custody pending psychological evaluation and species-appropriate behavioral modification. He gestured to his companions, who began moving toward Maya with the calm efficiency of beings who had done this many times before. One of them produced what looked like a restraint harness designed for small humanoids. That was when Sarah Chun, veteran of the Terran Defense Force and daughter of Deathworld Earth, made a decision that would echo throughout the galaxy. No, the word was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute finality. Sarah stepped in front of her daughter, and for the first time in the conversation, Ambassador Vexai hesitated. There was something in the human's posture, something in the way she held herself, that triggered an ancient predator recognition system buried deep in Zephyrian evolution. "Captain Chun, you will stand aside," Vexai said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. I said no. Sarah's hand moved to her hip, where the sidearm that humans were permitted to carry hung in its holster. "My daughter is not going anywhere with you." The cargo bay had gone deadly silent. Other humans in the area had stopped their conversations and turned to watch the confrontation. Marcus had moved to flank Sarah, his own hand near his weapon. The handful of alien merchants who had been browsing the human quarter began backing away, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere. "Captain Chun, you are threatening an official representative of the Galactic Confederation," Vexai said, his voice rising slightly. "This is an act of rebellion that could result in sanctions against your entire species." "Then, you'd better be very careful about your next move," Sarah replied calmly. For a moment that stretched into eternity, the two species regarded each other across the small space of the cargo bay. On one side stood the representatives of galactic civilization, beings who had ruled the stars for millennia and viewed humans as dangerous but manageable primitives. On the other side stood a human mother protecting her child, backed by the genetic legacy of a species that had climbed to the top of their world's food chain through sheer bloody-minded persistence. Vexai made his choice. He gestured sharply to his subordinates and barked an order in rapid Zephyrian. The two guards lunged forward, neural disruptors crackling to life. They never reached Maya. Sarah moved with the fluid grace of a predator in its prime. Her sidearm cleared its holster in a motion too fast for Zephyrian reflexes to track. The first guard went down with a smoking hole in his chest before his brain could process what was happening. The second managed to get his disruptor halfway up before Sarah's second shot took him in the throat. Ambassador Vexai found himself staring down the barrel of a Terran plasma pistol, his pale skin flushed with shock and terror. Behind Sarah, Maya was crying softly, but she was unharmed. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah said, her voice perfectly calm despite having just killed two beings in the span of 3 seconds. "You're going to walk away from here. You're going to forget about my daughter. And you're going to tell your superiors that if they want to test human children, they can start with your own offspring." Vexai's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. In 3 centuries of human integration into galactic society, no human had ever killed Confederation officials. There had been protests, legal challenges, and even the occasional riot, but never open violence against diplomatic personnel. You cannot," he stammered. "I just did." Sarah's finger tightened slightly on the trigger, and Vexai took an involuntary step backward. "Now you have a choice. You can walk away and live to file your complaint with the Confederation Council, or you could try to take my daughter and join your friends on the floor. What's it going to be?" The ambassador looked down at the bodies of his guards, then back up at the human woman who had killed them without hesitation. Something fundamental had changed in the past few minutes, something that his diplomatic training had never prepared him for. For the first time in his long career, he was face to face with a human who had stopped pretending to be civilized. This is not over," he whispered. "Yes, it is," Sarah replied. "You just don't know it yet." Vexai backed toward the exit, his pale eyes never leaving Sarah's weapon. When he reached the threshold, he turned and fled, his diplomatic robes billowing behind him as he ran. The cargo bay remained silent for several long moments after his departure. Then, Maya's quiet crying broke the spell, and Sarah holstered her weapon and knelt to embrace her daughter. "It's okay, baby," she whispered into Maya's hair. "Mommy's not going to let anyone hurt you." But even as she comforted her child, Sarah Chin knew that she had just declared war on the galaxy. Within hours, news of the incident would reach the Confederation Council. Within days, there would be warships in Earth's system and demands for her extradition. The careful balance that humanity had maintained for 3 centuries was about to collapse. She had chosen her daughter over her species' place in galactic civilization, and she would make that choice again in a heartbeat. Around the marketplace, other humans were beginning to react to what they had witnessed. Some looked shocked, others frightened. But on more than a few faces, Sarah could see something else: approval, recognition, the look of people who had been pushed too far for too long and were finally seeing someone push back. Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, you know what this means." She nodded grimly. "It means no more games. No more being civilized while they treat us like animals. The whole galaxy is going to come down on us for this." Sarah looked down at her daughter's tear-stained face, then back up at her old friend. When she spoke, her voice carried the cold certainty of someone who had already made peace with the consequences of her actions. Then they'd better bring enough ships. Of the day the humans snapped. News traveled fast in the age of quantum communication networks, but some news traveled faster than others. Within 6 hours of Ambassador Vexhi's humiliating retreat from the human quarter of Kepler Station, encrypted messages were bouncing between Confederation outposts across 36 star systems. The official channels buzzed with diplomatic protests and demands for immediate action. The unofficial channels carried something far more dangerous: first-hand accounts of what had actually happened in that cargo bay. Admiral Kethvar of the Zephyrian Third Fleet was reviewing the incident reports in his private quarters aboard the dreadnought Celestial Harmony when his aide announced an urgent communication from the Confederation High Council. The Admiral's face darkened as he absorbed the details of what his people insisted on calling the terrorist attack on Kepler Station. 2 diplomatic guards murdered in cold blood, he muttered, his blue-tinged fingers drumming against his desk. And the perpetrator allowed to simply walk away. This is what comes of treating Deathworlders as equals. The communication from the High Council was brief and to the point. Locate Captain Sarachun and her daughter, arrest them both, and make it clear to the human population that such acts of rebellion would not be tolerated. The Admiral smiled coldly as he drafted his response. The Third Fleet had been conducting routine exercises in the Tau Ceti system, less than 2 parsecs from Earth itself. A show of force was exactly what these primitive mammals needed. Meanwhile, aboard Kepler Station, Sarachun was discovering that killing Confederation officials had certain immediate practical complications. The station's automated security systems had flagged her as a hostile actor, which meant she couldn't access most commercial areas without triggering alerts. More concerning was the fact that the station's docking control had mysteriously developed computer glitches that prevented her ship from undocking. "They're stalling," Marcus said as he reviewed the error messages scrolling across his cargo bay's communication terminal. "Keeping you here until their enforcement ships arrive." Sarah nodded grimly. She had expected this. The Confederation couldn't simply let a human kill their officials without consequences, but they also couldn't risk appearing weak by negotiating. The only solution was overwhelming force. "How long do you think we have?" she asked. Zephyrian Third Fleet was last spotted in Tau Ceti, maybe 18 hours out if they pushed their engines. Marcus paused, studying her face. "Sarah, you don't have to do this alone. There are 43 human-registered ships docked at this station. Most of their crews saw what happened in the marketplace. And they're asking questions about the collar laws, about the testing protocols, about why we've been accepting this treatment for 300 years. Sarah felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. She had spent years telling herself that patience was a virtue, that humanity's gradual integration into galactic society was worth the humiliation and restrictions. But seeing the fear in her daughter's eyes when those aliens tried to take her away had burned away every rational justification she had ever constructed. Marcus, I need you to send a message to Earth. Command priority, Admiral Zhang at Terra Command. What message? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring out through the cargo bay's viewport at the alien ships that filled the station's docking rings. Sleek Altarian cruisers, massive Andromedan freight haulers, and the occasional predatory shape of a Confederation patrol vessel. For 3 centuries, humanity had been guests in this galaxy, always careful not to offend their hosts. "Tell them it's time to come home," she said finally. "All of us." The message that reached Earth's Terran Defense Command 16 hours later was brief, but it carried the weight of inevitability. Admiral Rebecca Zhang, commander of Earth's home fleet and veteran of humanity's integration wars, read the report 3 times before calling an emergency session of the Defense Council. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said as the holographic forms of Earth's military leadership materialized around the conference table, "we have a problem." The briefing was stark and unforgiving. A human civilian had killed 2 Confederation officials. A Zephyrian fleet was moving toward human space. And, according to intercepted communications, the Confederation was preparing to implement enhanced security measures for all human worlds. "Enhanced security measures," repeated General Harrison of the Terra Marine Corps. "Anyone want to translate that from diplomatic speak?" "Occupation," Admiral Zhang said flatly. "They're going to park enforcement fleets in orbit of every human colony and impose martial law until they're satisfied we've learned our lesson." The silence that followed was pregnant with implications. Humanity had 23 worlds scattered across Confederation space, most of them lightly defended by local militia forces that had been deliberately restricted by treaty agreements. Against a concerted Confederation assault, they would last hours at best. "What are our options?" asked General Morrison of the Strategic Defense Force. Admiral Zhang activated the holographic display that dominated the center of the table. Star charts sprang to life, showing the disposition of human and alien forces across local space. The picture was not encouraging. "Conventionally speaking, we have none," she said. "The Confederation outguns us 50 to 1, and their technology is superior in most categories. In a straight fight, we lose." "But," prompted General Harrison. "But this isn't a straight fight." Zhang manipulated the display, highlighting shipping routes and communication networks that connected the various alien worlds. "For 3 centuries, we've been the Confederation's merchant marine. Human ships carry their goods, human crews maintain their infrastructure, human engineers keep their technology running. We know their systems better than they do." Understanding began to dawn on several faces around the table. "You're talking about economic warfare," said General Morrison. "I'm talking about total warfare," Zhang corrected. "The Confederation has made a fundamental miscalculation. They think we've been submissive because we're weak. They don't understand that we've been submissive because we chose to be civilized." She gestured, and the display shifted to show deployment patterns for Earth's naval forces. Unlike the massive, heavily armed vessels favored by most Confederation species, human ships were smaller, faster, and designed for flexibility rather than raw firepower. "They want to treat us like animals," Admiral Zhang continued, her voice growing colder with each word. "They want to collar our children and cage our families. They think that because we come from a death world, we must be savage and primitive." She smiled, and every person around the table felt a chill run down their spine. They're about to learn the difference between savage and efficient. The orders that went out from Terran Command over the next 6 hours would have seemed impossible to execute just days earlier. Every human ship in Confederation space received the same message: return to human-controlled systems immediately, using any means necessary. More importantly, as they left, they were to implement Protocol 7. Protocol 7 was a theoretical contingency that had been developed during the early days of human integration into galactic society. It had never been implemented, never even seriously considered, because the political ramifications would have been catastrophic. But political considerations were no longer relevant. Captain James Liu received the activation order while his freight hauler was docked at a vegan agricultural station, loading grain shipments destined for 36 alien worlds. He read the message twice, then walked to his engineering bay and began pulling critical components from the station's main computer core. Without those components, the automated systems that controlled atmospheric recycling, gravity generation, and orbital mechanics would fail within hours. The vegans who tried to stop him discovered that human reflexes, evolved under Earth's crushing gravity, were considerably faster than their own. Lieutenant Maria Santos was halfway through a routine maintenance cycle on the hyperspace relay station at Wolf 359 when the order came through. The relay was a critical link in the Confederation's long-range communication network, handling data traffic for 17 star systems. It took her exactly 47 minutes to reprogram the system's security protocols to recognize human biometric signatures as administrative authority and lock out all other users. The Andromedan technicians who discovered the sabotage also learned that humans were remarkably creative when it came to improvising weapons from maintenance equipment. All across Confederation space, the pattern repeated itself. Human crews abandoned their posts, but not before ensuring that critical systems would fail in their absence. Cargo ships changed course for human space, but not before jettisoning their loads into the gravity wells of gas giants. Trading stations that had relied on human technical expertise for decades suddenly found themselves deaf, blind, and drifting. The Confederation leadership was still trying to understand the scope of the problem when Admiral Kethvar's Third Fleet arrived in the Sol system. Earth hung before them like a blue-white jewel, defended by what appeared to be a pathetically small collection of human vessels. Kethvar counted fewer than 30 ships, most of them the small, utilitarian designs favored by humanity's merchant marine. Against his fleet of 150 heavy cruisers and dreadnoughts, they would be swept aside like debris. Human vessels. This is Admiral Kethvar of the Zephyrian Third Fleet. He broadcast on all frequencies. You are ordered to stand down immediately and surrender the terrorist Sarah Chun and her accomplices. Failure to comply will result in the implementation of enhanced security measures for the Sol system. The response came from Admiral Zhang aboard the Terran Command ship Indefatigable. Admiral Kethvar, this is Admiral Rebecca Zhang of the Terran Defense Force. You are ordered to withdraw from this system immediately. We have no intention of surrendering anyone to your custody. Kethvar's lips twisted into a contemptuous smile. The Deathworlders were actually attempting to negotiate from a position of weakness. It would be amusing if it weren't so pathetic. Admiral Zhang, you appear to be laboring under some misapprehension about your situation. You are outnumbered 5-1 by superior vessels. Your surrender is not a request. Admiral Kethvar, I believe you are the one laboring under a misapprehension. Zhang's voice carried an odd note, something that Kethvar couldn't quite identify. You seem to think this is about Sarah Chun. It's not. Then what, pray tell, is this about? The pause that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. When Admiral Zhang spoke again, her words would be remembered throughout the galaxy for generations to come. This is about the day humanity stopped pretending to be civilized. The first indication that something had gone wrong came when Admiral Kethvar's flagship lost contact with the Confederation Command Authority. The quantum communication array that should have provided instantaneous contact with High Command was simply silent. His communications officer reported similar problems reaching fleet bases, relay stations, and administrative centers throughout Confederation space. The second indication was the complete failure of the fleet's navigation systems. The hyperspace beacons that allowed for precise long-range travel had gone offline simultaneously across a dozen star systems, leaving the Zephyrian ships effectively stranded in normal space. The third indication was the appearance of additional human ships dropping out of hyperspace behind his fleet. Admiral Zhang's voice came across the communication channels with what could only be described as satisfaction. Admiral Kethvar, meet the human merchant marine. All 47,000 ships, returning home after 3 centuries of faithful service. They've been kind enough to ensure that critical systems throughout Confederation space will remain non-functional until further notice. Kethvar stared at his tactical displays in growing horror. The small human fleet in front of him had grown to over 200 vessels, with more arriving every hour. But more terrifying than the numbers was the realization of what Admiral Zhang was actually telling him. Humanity hadn't just recalled their ships. They had systematically sabotaged the infrastructure of galactic civilization. "You're describing an act of war against every member of the Confederation," he managed to say. "No, Admiral Sangri Plaid Gamli. We're describing the natural consequence of treating Deathworlders like pets. You wanted to see what we're really capable of when we stop playing by your rules. Congratulations. You're about to get a very educational demonstration." The engagement that followed would be studied in military academies for centuries afterward. Admiral Kethvar had superior numbers, superior firepower, and superior defensive capabilities. What he didn't have was experience fighting an enemy that had evolved on a world where everything was trying to kill them. Human tactics reflected their origin, where Zephyrian doctrine emphasized defensive formations and methodical advance. Human ships struck like pack hunters, using their superior speed and maneuverability to attack from unexpected angles. They didn't try to match the aliens' firepower. Instead, they exploited every weakness, targeted every vulnerable system, and fought with the desperate creativity of beings who had learned that sometimes the only choice was between kill or die. Admiral Kethvar watched his carefully planned formation dissolve into chaos as human ships darted between his vessels like predators among prey. His shields held, his armor absorbed damage, but his ships were being systematically disabled rather than destroyed. Navigation systems, communication arrays, weapon targeting computers. The humans weren't trying to kill his crews, they were trying to strand them. When his flagship's main computer core was breached by a human boarding party led by a woman who moved like death incarnate, Admiral Kethvar finally understood what Admiral Zhang had been trying to tell him. This wasn't about territorial disputes or trade negotiations or diplomatic protocols. This was about the day the galaxy learned why humans called their homeworld a death world, and why everything else they lived on was just practice. The emergency session of the Galactic Confederation Council convened in a state of barely controlled panic. Representatives from 47 species filled the great chamber on the neutral world of Harmony Station, their various forms of atmospheric breathing apparatus creating a cacophony of hissing and whirring that normally would have been filtered out by the translation matrix. Today, however, the matrix was operating at partial capacity because the human technicians who maintained it had disappeared 3 days ago. Chancellor Vorthe K of the Andromedan Republic called the session to order with his forearms spread wide in the traditional gesture of peace. The irony was not lost on anyone present, given that they were here to discuss what appeared to be the complete collapse of galactic civilization. "Honored delegates," he began, his translated voice carrying an undercurrent of barely suppressed hysteria, "we face an unprecedented crisis. In the past 72 hours, every human-operated facility in Confederation space has gone offline. Transportation networks have failed. Communication systems are down. Food distribution has ceased. And our enforcement fleets report that they are unable to navigate beyond their current positions." A ripple of agitation swept through the assembled delegates. The Regalian ambassador, whose species had historically been humanity's strongest supporters, raised one of his elongated arms to request recognition. "Chancellor, surely this is some form of technical malfunction. The humans have always been reliable partners in maintaining galactic infrastructure. Perhaps if we offered to assist in repairs." "Ambassador Melthar," the Chancellor interrupted, "I'm afraid the situation is somewhat more complex than a technical malfunction." He activated the chamber's holographic display, showing a star chart of Confederation space that was disturbingly dark. Hundreds of systems that should have been showing green indicators for full operational status were now flickering red or had gone completely black. "This is the current status of our transportation and communication networks," he continued. "As you can see, the damage is not random. It follows the exact pattern of human technical involvement in our infrastructure. Every system they touched, every station they staffed, every piece of equipment they maintained has been either sabotaged or abandoned. The silence that followed was deafening. For 3 centuries, the Galactic Confederation had become increasingly dependent on human expertise. They were the galaxy's finest engineers, their death world origins giving them an intuitive understanding of systems operating under extreme stress. They were also the most reliable spacers, their merchant fleets carrying the bulk of interstellar trade. The thought that this vast network of human involvement could simply vanish overnight had never occurred to the Confederation leadership. Surely they can be reasoned with, suggested Ambassador Clix of the Centauran Alliance, his crystalline form chiming with harmonics that translated as concern. What are their demands? Territory? Resource rights? Reduced oversight restrictions? Chancellor Vorthay's expression grew even grimmer. That is where the situation becomes truly alarming. We have received exactly 1 communication from human leadership since this crisis began. The holographic display shifted to show the recorded image of Admiral Rebecca Zhang. Even in hologram form, there was something unsettling about the human's appearance. Where most Confederation officials presented themselves with careful diplomatic neutrality, Admiral Zhang looked like what she was, a predator in military uniform. To the Galactic Confederation Council, her recorded voice began, "Humanity hereby withdraws from all treaties, agreements, and cooperative arrangements entered into since our first contact with galactic civilization. All human citizens are recalled to human-controlled space immediately. Any attempt to prevent this withdrawal or to take punitive action against human populations will be met with appropriate response. We suggest you use the time this communication provides to reconsider your policies regarding Deathworld species." The recording ended, leaving the chamber in stunned silence. Ambassador Vexhai of the Zephyrian Diplomatic Corps was the first to speak, his voice shaking with indignation. This is clearly the result of terrorist actions by the criminal Sarah Chun and her accomplices. If we move quickly to arrest the perpetrators and make an example of them, the human population will see reason and return to their proper place in galactic society. Several delegates murmured agreement, but Chancellor Vorthke noticed that others looked less certain. Ambassador Meldar of Rigel Beta was studying the display with obvious concern. "Ambassador Vexhai," Meldar said slowly, "I believe you may be underestimating the scope of this situation. The level of coordination required to simultaneously disable infrastructure across 47 star systems would require the active participation of thousands of humans. This is not the work of a single terrorist. Then, it is a conspiracy that must be crushed before it spreads," Vexhai responded. "Admiral Kethvar's fleet is already in position at the human homeworld. A demonstration of overwhelming force will remind these Deathworlders of their obligations." As if summoned by his words, an emergency communication alert chimed through the chamber. Chancellor Vorthke accepted the incoming transmission, and the chamber filled with the familiar blue-tinted features of Admiral Kethvar. However, the Admiral's usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, and there was something in his eyes that might have been fear. "Honored Council," he began, his voice tight with controlled emotion, "I must report that the enforcement action in the Sol system has encountered complications." "What kind of complications, Admiral?" Chancellor Vorthke asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The human fleet has engaged our forces. My command reports severe losses to critical systems. Navigation is compromised, communications are intermittent, and approximately 30% of our vessels have been rendered incapable of offensive action." The chamber erupted in chaos. Delegates from species that had never seen military action gasped in shock, while representatives from more warlike civilizations demanded details. Ambassador Vexhai's pale skin had turned an interesting shade of purple. "Admiral, you have 150 ships of the line," he sputtered. "How is it possible that you are being defeated by a handful of human vessels?" Admiral Kethvar's expression hardened. "Honored Ambassador, I respectfully suggest that you have fundamentally misunderstood what we are facing here. These are not the passive, compliant humans that have served in our merchant fleets for centuries. These are Deathworlders who have decided to stop pretending to be civilized. The transmission flickered as another impact shook the Admiral's flagship. In the background, damage reports could be heard in rapid Zephyrian. I have engaged in 17 major fleet actions during my career, Admiral Kethvar continued. I have never encountered an enemy that fights like this. They don't meet us in traditional formation. They strike like predators, targeting our most vulnerable systems before disappearing into the void. Our sensors can barely track them, and our weapons cannot match their maneuverability. Surely you can adapt your tactics, Chancellor Vorthicase said, but his voice lacked conviction. Honored Chancellor, these tactics are not something that can be simply adopted. They require reflexes and instincts that evolved under extreme selective pressure. The humans move and think like apex predators because that is exactly what they are. We have been living alongside the galaxy's most dangerous species for 3 centuries, and we convinced ourselves they were harmless because they chose to behave in a civilized manner. The Admiral paused as another series of explosions rocked his ship. I am beginning to suspect that choice has been revoked. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the chamber in stunned silence. For several minutes, no one spoke. The implications of what they had just heard were too vast and terrifying to process immediately. Finally, Ambassador Meldar cleared his throat. Perhaps it would be wise to consider the human demands more carefully. You cannot be serious, Ambassador Vexhai snapped. They are terrorists and criminals. If we negotiate with them now, we legitimize their actions and invite similar rebellions from other species. What other species? Meldar asked quietly. Look around this chamber, Ambassador. Count the representatives from Deathworlds. See how many civilizations survived on planets hostile enough to produce warriors like the humans. Vexhai's mouth opened to reply, then closed again as the realization hit him. In the 3 centuries since the formation of the Galactic Confederation, dozens of species had been contacted and integrated into galactic society. Almost all of them came from garden worlds, planets with stable climates, and benevolent conditions that had allowed intelligence to evolve without constant existential pressure. Humanity was unique. They were the only species that had achieved space travel after evolving on a world that tried to kill them every single day. The humans have served as our merchant marine, our engineers, our technical specialists, Meldar continued. They maintain our transportation networks, our communication systems, our life support infrastructure. They know our weaknesses better than we do because we have spent 3 centuries depending on them to fix our problems. Chancellor Vorthicase was beginning to understand the scope of the catastrophe they faced. You're saying that our entire civilization is dependent on the cooperation of a single species. I'm saying that our entire civilization is dependent on the cooperation of a single species that we have been systematically oppressing for 300 years, Meldar corrected. And they have just demonstrated that they are capable of bringing galactic society to a complete halt whenever they choose to do so. The chamber fell silent again as the delegates absorbed this revelation. Outside the great windows of Harmony Station, the stars that had once represented a vast network of trade and communication now seemed cold and distant. For the first time in centuries, the galaxy felt very large and very dark. Ambassador Vexhai made one final attempt to salvage the situation. This is still ultimately about the terrorist Sarah Chun and her attack on diplomatic personnel. If we can capture her and make an example of her, the rest of the human population might still be brought to heel. Ambassador, came a new voice from the chamber's entrance. I believe you are laboring under a fundamental misapprehension. Every head turned to see a figure in the simple black uniform of the Terran Defense Force walking calmly into the chamber. The woman was middle-aged with graying hair and the kind of scars that spoke of a lifetime spent in dangerous places. What was most unsettling about her was the complete absence of deference or nervousness that every other being displayed when entering the presence of the Galactic Council. "I am Captain Sarah Chun," she announced simply. "I understand you've been looking for me." The chamber erupted in chaos once again. Security alerts began sounding as the automated systems recognized that the galaxy's most wanted terrorist had just walked into the heart of Confederation government. Guards reached for weapons, delegates scrambled for exits, and Ambassador Vexhai stood frozen in shock. "Before you do anything hasty," Sarah continued, her voice cutting through the pandemonium with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in crisis situations, "you might want to consider that my ship has been shadowing this station for the past 6 hours. If I don't send an all-clear signal every 30 minutes, my crew has orders to target your primary reactor." The guards hesitated, their weapons halfway drawn. Chancellor Vorthe K raised his 4 arms in the universal gesture for restraint. "Captain Chun," he said carefully, "what is it that you want?" Sarah smiled, and every being in the chamber felt their fight-or-flight responses activate. "I want to make you an offer," she said. "One that I think you'll find very reasonable, given the current circumstances." She walked to the center of the chamber, ignoring the fact that dozens of weapons were trained on her from every direction. When she reached the speaking podium traditionally reserved for heads of state, she turned to address the assembled delegates. "For 3 centuries, humanity has played by your rules," she began. "We've worn your collars, submitted to your tests, and allowed you to treat us as dangerous animals who needed to be carefully managed. We told ourselves that this was the price of civilization, that integration into galactic society was worth the humiliation." Her voice hardened, carrying the weight of 300 years of accumulated resentment. "You made a mistake 3 days ago. You tried to take my daughter away from me for behavioral modification. You wanted to cage a human child because her genetics made you nervous. And in that moment, I realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning." She looked around the chamber, her eyes meeting those of each delegate in turn. "We don't need you. You need us." The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe. "So here's my offer," Sarah continued. "Humanity will withdraw from Confederation space and establish our own territories. We'll take our ships, our expertise, and our troublesome genetics with us. In return, we won't actively interfere with your attempts to rebuild the infrastructure we've left behind. And if we refuse..." Ambassador Vexhai managed to ask. Sarah's smile widened, and several delegates unconsciously stepped backward. "Then you'll learn why evolution produced Deathworlders in the first place." 5 years later, Ambassador Meldar of Rigel Beta stood on the observation deck of the research station New Harmony, watching the construction of humanity's latest deep space facility. The massive structure taking shape in the void was unlike anything in Confederation space, a fusion of human engineering and salvaged alien technology that served as both shipyard and fortress. It was beautiful in the way that predators were beautiful, sleek, efficient, and unmistakably dangerous. "Remarkable, isn't it?" came a voice behind him. Meldar turned to see Admiral Rebecca Zhang approaching, her hair now completely silver, but her bearing as sharp as ever. The years since humanity's withdrawal from Confederation space had been kind to her. Command of an independent human fleet suited her far better than the political compromises required for galactic integration. "Admiral Zhang," Meldar acknowledged with a respectful nod. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. Thank you for requesting it through proper channels instead of sending a battle fleet to demand negotiations," Zhang replied with what might have been amusement. "It's refreshing to deal with Confederation representatives who understand that the old rules no longer apply." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching human work crews maneuver massive structural components with the easy competence of beings who had spent generations learning to thrive in hostile environments. The construction technique was uniquely human, fast, adaptable, and designed to function even under the most adverse conditions. "Your people have accomplished remarkable things in 5 years," Meldar observed. 17 colonies established, 3 major shipyards operational, and a merchant network that rivals anything in Confederation space. We learn fast when we're not spending half our energy being diplomatic, Zhang said dryly. Amazing what you can accomplish when you stop pretending to be something you're not. Meldhar's crystalline form chimed softly with what translated as thoughtful agreement. The past 5 years have been difficult ones for the Galactic Confederation. The sudden loss of human expertise had crippled interstellar commerce, stranded colonies without adequate life support maintenance, and left the transportation network operating at less than 30% efficiency. Several worlds have been forced to implement emergency rationing, and at least 2 minor wars had broken out over access to the remaining functional hyperspace routes. Which brings me to why I'm here, he said carefully. The Confederation Council has authorized me to present a formal proposal for renewed cooperation. Admiral Zhang's expression didn't change, but something cold and predatory entered her eyes. How generous of them. What kind of cooperation do they have in mind? Limited technical exchange, shared access to hyperspace navigation data, perhaps some joint research initiatives on neutral worlds. Meldhar paused, then added with obvious reluctance, and the establishment of formal diplomatic recognition for human territorial claims, in exchange for restoration of critical infrastructure in Confederation space. Nothing too extensive, just enough to get our transportation and communication networks back to functional levels. Zhang was quiet for a long moment, watching a human cargo ship dock with a construction platform. The vessel was a new design, sleeker, and more heavily armed than the merchant ships that had served Confederation trade routes for centuries. Everything about it spoke of a species that had learned to defend what was theirs. Ambassador, do you know what the most common request we receive from alien refugees is? She asked finally. Meldhar's form chimed with confusion. Refugee? Oh yes, we get them regularly. Aliens from Confederation world who decide they'd rather take their chances with the dangerous Deathworlders than continue living under the enlightened guidance of galactic civilization. Zhang smiled, and Meldhar was reminded once again that human expressions of amusement could be quite unsettling. Want to know what they ask for? Ah, yes. They ask us to remove their tracking implants, the ones that monitor their biological functions and broadcast their location to government authorities at all times. They can't believe that humans live without constant surveillance, that our children grow up without behavior modification devices, that we consider privacy a basic right rather than a privilege to be earned. Meldhar's crystalline form dimmed slightly. The Confederation's approach to social order relied heavily on monitoring and preemptive intervention. It had always been justified as necessary for maintaining peace among dozens of species with different biological imperatives and cultural values. Your point being? My point being that your offer of cooperation assumes we want to go back to being junior partners in a civilization that treats individual liberty as a security threat. Zhang turned to face him fully, and Meldhar was struck by how different she looked from the human officers he had worked with during the integration years. There was no deference, no careful calculation of how to avoid giving offense. She looked like someone who had stopped caring what other people thought of her. Ambassador, I'm going to share something with you that might help you understand the current situation. Would you like to know what Captain Sarachan is doing these days? Yes, actually. The Council has been wondering about her current status. She's a teacher. She runs a school on New Terra for human children who grew up in Confederation space. Kids who spent their formative years wearing monitoring collars and being told they were too dangerous to be trusted with normal freedoms. Zhang's voice carried an edge of barely controlled anger. Do you know what the most common problem these children have? Meldhar shook his head. They don't know how to make decisions without asking permission first. They've been so thoroughly conditioned to seek approval from authority figures that they literally cannot function as independent beings. It takes months of therapy to teach them that they're allowed to have opinions that differ from official policy. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Meldar had never considered the psychological impact of the Confederation's monitoring systems on the children who grew up under them. Admiral, I understand your concerns, but surely some form of cooperation is possible. The galaxy was more stable when humanity was part of the Confederation. Was it? Zhang asked. Or was it just more convenient for the species at the top of the hierarchy? She gestured toward the viewport, where the lights of human settlements could be seen scattered across the local star cluster. Each one represented a world where humans lived according to their own values, answering to their own authorities, and raising their children without the constant oversight of alien bureaucrats. Ambassador, let me tell you what we've learned in the past 5 years. We've learned that we don't need the Confederation's protection, because nothing in this galaxy is more dangerous than we are. We've learned that we don't need the Confederation's technology, because we're perfectly capable of building our own. And, most importantly, we've learned that we don't need the Confederation's approval to live the way we choose to live. Meldar's form chimed with what might have been desperation. Admiral, the infrastructure problems are becoming critical. Several Confederation worlds are experiencing life support failures. Without human technical expertise, you'll have to learn to fix your own problems, Zhang interrupted. Just like we did for the first few million years of our existence. You would let entire civilizations collapse rather than provide assistance. Zhang considered this for a moment. Ambassador, do you remember the Centauran trade war? About 15 years ago, of course, a minor territorial dispute that was resolved through mediation. Do you remember who provided the mediation services? The Confederation Arbitration Council. Naturally. Do you remember who actually negotiated the settlement? Who spent 3 months shuttling between Centauran and Altarian delegates, working out the technical details of resource-sharing agreements and trade route management? Meldar's form dimmed as he realized where this was going. Human diplomatique corps personnel. Human diplomatic corps personnel who were never credited for their work, never acknowledged for their expertise, and never consulted when the Confederation decided to implement new policies regarding potentially unstable species. Zhang's voice hardened. You used us, Ambassador. For 3 centuries, you used our skills, our loyalty, and our willingness to do the dirty work that kept galactic civilization functioning. And the entire time, you told yourself that you were doing us a favor by allowing us to participate. She walked to the viewport and placed her hand against the transparent aluminum, looking out at the human fleet that now patrolled the borders of their territory. So to answer your question, no, we won't let civilizations collapse. If you ask for help, genuinely ask, with the understanding that you're requesting assistance from equals rather than demanding service from inferiors. We'll probably provide it. We're not monsters, despite what your propaganda might say. But, Meldar prompted, but we won't go back to being your servants. We won't put our children in your cages. And we won't pretend that your way of organizing society is the only possible path to civilization. She turned back to face him. If the Confederation wants to establish formal relations with human space, you're welcome to send an ambassador. But they'll be expected to follow our laws while they're in our territory, just like any other foreign diplomat. Meldar absorbed this in silence. The proposal he had been authorized to present suddenly seemed woefully inadequate. The Confederation had approached these negotiations with the assumption that humanity could be bribed or coerced back into compliance. They had not prepared for the possibility that humans might simply no longer care about galactic approval. What would you require for a formal treaty? He asked finally. Recognition of human territorial sovereignty, mutual respect for each other's internal affairs, and an end to any attempts to restrict human movement or settlement based on our genetic origins. Zhang paused. Oh, and one more thing. Yes. Any Confederation citizen who requests asylum in human space will be granted it. No questions asked. We won't forcibly repatriate anyone who decides they'd rather live under our system of governance. The Council will never accept that condition. It would legitimize defection from Confederation worlds. Then, the Council can continue trying to run galactic civilization without human expertise, Zhang said simply. But I should warn you that several other Deathworld species have been watching our example with considerable interest. The Vorthan Republic has already established diplomatic relations with us, and rumor has it that the Kretak clans are considering similar independence movements. Melthar's crystalline form flickered with alarm. The Vorthans were renowned for their military capabilities, and the Kretak clans controlled some of the galaxy's most valuable mining operations. If other Deathworld species began following humanity's example, Ambassador, Zhang continued, you can go back to the Council and tell them that the age of human compliance is over. We're not your servants, we're not your pets, and we're certainly not your property. We're your neighbors now. You can treat us with respect and work with us as equals, or you can try to go it alone. She smiled, and Melthar was reminded once again that humans were the product of a world that had spent millions of years trying to kill them. But I should warn you that trying to force us back into compliance would be a very serious mistake. Because the day we snapped wasn't an aberration. It was a revelation. We've remembered who we are and what we're capable of when we stop holding back. Melthar looked out at the human fleet patrolling the space around their construction platform. Every ship bristled with weapons that had been designed by beings who understood warfare on a level that most galactic species had never needed to comprehend. These weren't the submissive, grateful humans who had served the Confederation for 3 centuries. These were apex predators who had decided to stop pretending to be house pets. I'll convey your terms to the Council, he said finally. Good. Admiral Zhang extended her hand in the human gesture of farewell, and after a moment's hesitation, Melthar reached out with one of his crystalline appendages to complete the contact. And Ambassador, when you make your report, make sure they understand something important. What's that? We didn't snap because we were weak or unstable or genetically defective. We snapped because we remember that our ancestors didn't crawl their way to the top of Earth's food chain by asking politely for permission to exist. Zhang's grip was firm, carrying the strength of someone who had spent a lifetime preparing for combat. The galaxy has been peaceful for 3 centuries because we chose to be peaceful. That choice can be revoked at any time. As Melthar's ship departed human space several hours later, he found himself looking back at the constellation of lights that marked the border of humanity's growing territory. For 3 centuries, the Galactic Confederation had convinced itself that it had tamed the dangerous species from the Death World called Earth. They had been wrong. Humanity hadn't been tamed. They had simply been waiting for the right moment to remind the galaxy what apex predators looked like when they stopped holding back. The message Melthar carried back to the Confederation Council was simple. The Deathworlders had snapped, and there was no going back. The galaxy would have to learn to live with them as equals, or face the consequences of treating them as anything less. After 3 centuries of believing they had domesticated Earth's children, galactic civilization was about to discover that some species couldn't be caged. They could only be respected.